Democracy is a form of government in which the people have the authority to deliberate and decide legislation or to choose governing officials to do so. The word comes from combining demos, which was the Latin word for common people, and kratos, meaning force or might. Demos, kratos. Cornerstones of democracy include freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom of speech, inclusiveness, equality, citizenship, consent of the governed, voting rights, freedom from unwarranted governmental deprivation of the right to life and liberty, and minority rights. The notion of democracy has evolved over time considerably. The original form of democracy was a direct democracy. The most common form of democracy today is a representative democracy, where the people elect government officials to govern on their behalf. In the common variant of liberal democracy, the powers of the majority are exercised within the framework of a representative democracy, but the constitution limits the majority and protects the minority, usually through the enjoyment of all of certain individual rights, such as freedom of speech or freedom of association. The term democracy appeared in the 5th century BC to denote the political systems then existing in Greek city-states, notably classical Athens, to mean rule of the people in contrast to aristocracy, meaning rule of an elite. Historically, democracies and republics have been rare. Democracies had been linked to small size, because as political units grew in size, the likelihood increased that the government would turn despotic. At the same time, small political units were vulnerable to conquest. Montesquieu, a French philosopher, wrote that, "If a republic be small, it is destroyed by a foreign force. If it be large, it is ruined by an internal imperfection." According to Johns Hopkins University political scientist Daniel Juni, the creation of the United States with its large size and its system of checks and balances was a solution to the dual problems of size. Athenian democracy took the form of a direct democracy, and it had two distinguishing features. The random selection of ordinary citizens to fill the few existing government administrative and judicial offices, and a legislative assembly consisting of all Athenian citizens. All eligible citizens were allowed to speak and vote in the assembly, which set the laws of the city-state. However, Athenian citizenship excluded women, slaves, foreigners, and youths below the age of military service. Effectively, only 1 in 4 residents in Athens qualified as citizens. Owning land was not a requirement for citizenship. The exclusion of large parts of the population from the citizen body is closely related to the ancient understanding of citizenship. In most of antiquity, the benefit of citizenship was tied to the obligation to fight war campaigns. The Greeks at the time had no concept or word for human rights, but those who were citizens of Athens enjoyed their liberties not in opposition to the government, but by living in a city that was not subject to another power and by not being subjects themselves to the rule of another person. Range voting appeared in Sparta as early as 700 BC. The Apella was an assembly of the people held once a month in which every male citizen of at least 30 years of age could participate. In the Apella, Spartans elected leaders and cast votes by shouting. The vote is then decided by how loudly the crowd would shout. Aristotle called this childish when compared with the stone voting ballots used by the Athenian citizenry. Sparta adopted range voting because of its simplicity and to prevent any biased voting, buying, or cheating that was predominant in early democratic elections. In the Middle Ages, most regions in Europe were ruled by clergy or feudal lords. In the year 1215, the Parliament of England first emerged in order to restrict the power of kings, and its rules were written into the Magna Carta. These rules explicitly protected certain rights of the king's subjects and implicitly supported what became the English writ of habeas corpus, safeguarding individual freedom against unlawful imprisonment with right to appeal. After the English Civil War between 1642 and 1651 and the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the Bill of Rights was enacted in 1689, which codified certain rights and liberties and is still in effect. The bill set out the requirement for regular elections, rules for freedom of speech in Parliament, and limited the power of the monarch, ensuring that, unlike much of Europe at the time, royal absolutism would not prevail. This led to a growth of activity in the field of political philosophy in Britain. Thomas Hobbes was the first philosopher to articulate a detailed social contract theory. In 1651, Hobbes theorized that individuals living in the state of nature led lives that were solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and constantly waged a war of all against all. In order to prevent the occurrence of a state of anarchy, Hobbes reasoned that individuals ceded their rights to a strong authoritarian government. Later, philosopher and physician John Locke would posit a different interpretation of the social contract theory. Writing in his two treatises of government in 1689, Locke posited that all individuals possessed the inalienable right to life, liberty, and property. Where Hobbes saw humans as wanting to cede their rights to an authority to avoid anarchy, Locke believed that instead, individuals would voluntarily come together to form a state for the purposes of defending their rights. Particularly important for Locke were property rights, whose protection Locke deemed to be a government's primary purpose. Furthermore, Locke asserted that governments were legitimate only if they held the consent of the governed. Controversially, he believed that citizens had the right to revolt, violently if needed, against a government that acted against their interest or became tyrannical. Although his words were not widely read during his lifetime, Locke's works are considered to be the founding documents of liberal thought and profoundly influenced the leaders of the American Revolution and later, the French Revolution. His liberal democratic framework of governance remains the preeminent form of democracy in the world today. In the American colonial period before 1776 and for some time after, often only adult white male property owners could vote. Enslaved Africans, most free black people, and most women were not extended the franchise. This changed state by state, beginning with the Republican state of New Connecticut, soon after called Vermont, which on declaring independence of Great Britain in 1777, adopted a constitution that allowed for citizenship and democratic suffrage for males with or without property, and went on to abolish slavery. The American Revolution led to the adoption of the United States Constitution in 1787, the oldest surviving still active governmental codified constitution. The Bill of Rights in 1791 set limits on government power to protect personal freedoms, but had little impact on judgments by the courts for the first 130 years after ratification. Generally, states limited suffrage to white male property owners and taxpayers. At the time of the first presidential election in 1789, only about 6% of the population was eligible to vote. In the 1860 United States Census, the slave population had grown to 4 million, and in Reconstruction after the Civil War, 3 constitutional amendments were passed. The 13th Amendment in 1865 ended slavery. The 14th Amendment in 1869 gave black people citizenship, and the 15th Amendment in 1870 gave black males a nominal right to vote. Full enfranchisement of citizens was not secured until after the Civil Rights Movement, where Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. 20th century transitions to liberal democracies have come in waves of successive democracy, variously resulting from wars, revolutions, decolonization, and religious and economic circumstances. Global waves of democratic regression, reversing democratization, have also occurred during this time. World War I and the dissolution of the autocratic Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires resulted in the creation of new nation-states in Europe, most of them at least nominally democratic. In the 1920s, democratic movements flourished and women's suffrage advanced. But the Great Depression brought disenchantment, and most of the countries of Europe, Latin America, and Asia turned to strongman rule or dictatorships. Fascism and dictatorships flourished in Nazi Germany, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, as well as non-democratic governments in the Baltics, the Balkans, Brazil, Cuba, China, and Japan, among others. World War II brought a definitive reversal of this trend in Western Europe. The democratization of the American, British, and French sectors of occupied Germany, Austria, Italy, and the occupied Japan served as a model for the later theory of government change. However, most of Eastern Europe, including the Soviet sector of Germany, fell into the non-democratic Soviet-dominated bloc. Economic malaise in the 1980s, along with resentment of Soviet oppression, contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the associated end of the Cold War, and the democratization and liberalization of the former Eastern Bloc countries. In 1986, after the toppling of the most prominent Asian dictatorship, the only democratic state of its kind at the time emerged in the Philippines with the rise of Corazon Aquino, who would later be known as the mother of Asian democracy. The liberal trend spread to some states in Africa in the 1990s, most prominently in South Africa. Some recent examples of attempts of liberalization include the Indonesian Revolution of 1998, the Bulldozer Revolution in Yugoslavia, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon, the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan, and the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia. According to the World Forum on Democracy, in the year 2000, the number of electoral democracies now represent 120 of the 192 existing countries and constitute 58.2% of the world's population. Research from Freedom House, an organization founded on the core principle that freedom flourishes in democratic nations, indicated that starting in 2005, there have been 11 consecutive years in which declines in political rights and civil liberties throughout the world have outnumbered improvements. Democratic backsliding in the 2010s were attributed to economic inequality and social discontentment, personalism, poor management of COVID-19 pandemic, as well as other factors such as government manipulation of civil society, toxic polarization, foreign disinformation campaigns, racism, nativism, excessive executive power, and decreased power of the opposition. Within English-speaking Western democracies, protection-based attitudes combining cultural conservatism and leftist economic attitudes were the strongest predictors of support for authoritarian modes of governance.